Welcome to all delegates who have joined the All Fashion Sourcing webinar in partnership with the USA Trade Hub, addressing the topic of why African fashion matters. I would like to introduce George McCory, the Deputy Chief of Party of the USA Trade Hub, who will kick off the webinar and do the formal introductions. Over to you, George.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Neil. Good afternoon, colleagues, and a warm welcome to the webinar, and welcome to those that have attended this webinar organized by the USAID Trade Hub and Messi Frankfurt. I said this webinar meaning the series that we have been having. So we welcome you, and also I welcome those that have attended other webinars that the USAID Trade Hub has organized in the past. Thank you very much for continuing to attend the webinar. Now, as Neil said, I'm the Deputy Chief of Party. For those that do not know me, my name is George McCory. I work with the USAID Southern Africa Trade and Investment Hub, which is a USAID funded project based in Pretoria. And our scope covers 8 countries, although we operate in the Southern Africa region. We cover 8 out of the 16 SADC countries. And these are Eswatini, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi. I like to call them SACU +3 because it's the 5 SACU countries plus 3 countries, which are Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi. So our role as the USAID Southern Africa Trade Hub is to work with companies in the region to increase sustainable economic growth, global export competitiveness, and trade in the region. Now, we do have 3 main objectives as the USAID Trade Hub. And the 3 main objectives are also linked to what I've just mentioned above. And the first objective is to increase or help increase exports from 7 Southern African countries of the 8 that I mentioned. And we are looking at 7 countries besides South Africa, because we work with firms in those countries to help them export or increase trade between those 7 countries and South Africa. So increasing trade between the 7 countries and South Africa. That's the first objective. The second objective, which is linked to that, and to some extent, the reason why we're having this webinar today is that of helping the whole, all the 8 countries or companies, firms from all the 8 countries to find markets in the United States under the African Growth and Opportunity Act program. So we work with firms that have products that qualify under the AGOA program to find markets in the US, so that you can actually then be able to export to the US. And this particular event we're having today is actually aimed at that, getting us to understand fashion, understand the textiles and apparel world, and as well as how we can then export to the US under the program. Then linked to that, our third objective is because of our realization that most of the firms do tend to have challenges getting funding to then fund their businesses so that they can be able to increase production, get the required certifications, and other things that will make you able to export to South Africa as well as to the US. So we identify firms that have a need for funding, and then we also identify firms here in South Africa that can actually assist with the funding, and we link up the two entities so that they can actually find ways of doing business, particularly when it comes to issues of providing funding as well as technology transfer from South Africa into the 7 countries out of the 8 that I mentioned. So that's what, in general, what the USAID Trade Hub does. And back to you now.
Thank you, George. That was great. And now I would like to introduce you to my colleague. Her name is Catherine Frew. She's the portfolio director at Messi Frankfurt, South Africa, and heads up all fashion sourcing. So, Kath, welcome. You're going to tell us a little bit about this event coming up in November.
Thank you, Neil, and hello, everyone. Like Neil mentioned, my name is Kath, and I'm the show director of All Fashion Sourcing Cape Town. All Fashion Sourcing has formed an integral platform in the past for the gathering of like-minded individuals who've always come together to network, to source, to gather information on new trends, or to find new suppliers, and obviously all of which is not possible this year due to the situation that the world is currently facing. And to continue our quest as Messi Frankfurt South Africa to support the apparel, the textile, footwear, leather, and fashion industries in Southern Africa, we're taking All Fashion Sourcing Cape Town onto a virtual platform in 2020. And to ensure that we deliver a promising virtual event, All Fashion Sourcing Cape Town will now take place from the 3rd to the 5th of November this year. This will allow us all adequate time to prepare the platform for a successful online experience for both the visitors and the exhibitors. And the most important aspect of this being that we would like to ensure that all the onboarding processes are seamless and all our users know how to use the platform and all its functionalities to its full potential. The online event will serve as an alternative platform for our exhibitors and our visitors to continuously connect and network with buyers all around the world, as well as to keep their presence in the current global market. The key features of the platform this year will include artificial intelligence-powered matchmaking capabilities, a personalized exhibitor and product search platform, scheduled video meetings and integrated live streaming of seminars and content sessions. If you would like to participate in this business-orientated marketplace, please log on to our website, which is allfashionsourcing.com, and there you'll find all the information on the event. And just in closing, I'd like to thank the team at USAID for making this webinar series possible, and we can't wait to welcome you all onto the All Fashion Sourcing platform in November this year.
Thank you, Kath. On that exciting note, and it really is, this event is going to be a special event. And for us, like Kath said, you know, going virtual has a lot of pluses and benefits. But on that note, I would like to introduce Nicola Cooper, the founder, trend research analyst, and cultural strategist of Nicola Cooper and Associations, who will introduce the various speakers and host the session on behalf of All Fashion Sourcing and the USAID Trade Hub. And just a little bit about Nicola, and I know she's not going to like it when I do this introduction, but she has a formidable presence on Africa's fashion and lifestyle landscapes. She's at the cutting edge. Her observations are acutely tuned to the present moment, while she is inextricably linked to the past eras and movements, and her gaze is ever set on the shifting future. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have partnered with Nicola, not just for today, but also for the All Fashion Sourcing event coming up in November. She is an amazing individual, and her knowledge is second to none. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to you, Nicola, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen with everybody. If you can just give me a moment. It's probably the most used phrase of 2020. Can everyone see my screen?
No.
Yes?
Yes.
No.
Okay, I'm going to go straight into it. So thank you very much. I'm going to be showing you a lot more pictures than my face. And hopefully today we're going to take you through some really sort of valid points. Obviously, we're throwing a lot of information at you in a short space of time. So we're going to try and get it across to you the quickest way possible, to give us a Q&A session with our really valuable panelists at the very end. So I do encourage you to put forward questions, because if we cannot get to your questions during the webinar, we will do so thereafter and they will be published on the site. So I think it's really important that you are able to speak with our panelists, even if it is in an indirect manner. So just to kickstart, yes.
Nicola, sorry, we can't see your screen. Please just have a look at that for us, please.
Sure. Let's see if we can now.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you,
Awesome.
Nicola.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody. So just going back to that former slide, there's quite a lot of information I'm going to be throwing at you, as I usually do every year. But I would just like to thank All Fashion Sourcing and all the valuable partners in the program. And just going to shift on to welcoming Dr. Erica de Greef, who is the co-director of the African Fashion Research Institute. Erica and I have a long-standing, both personal and professional relationship, and I think, you know, as a valuable contributor to the African fashion narrative and research spaces. Those of you who are familiar with her work will know her really well, and those of you who are not, I hope you get great insight from her today. And then Sim Dube, who is the USAID portfolio manager for the Trade Hub. I think it's such an interesting time for us as South Africans and Africans going into the larger global market and joining global conversations. So it's really interesting for us to be able to communicate with the rest of the world from within Africa rather from outside looking into Africa. So I'm going to get into it, and just to explain how I would like to contextualize this particular presentation is that I'm just going to throw some information to build the foundation on which Erica and Sim and myself can engage in terms of panelist discussion. So I thought this would be an apt way to kickstart our convos.
A journey is a gift. Who are you? I feel like I'm not a king yet. I feel like I got potential for it, but I'm not there yet 100%. The ancestors never left you. That is an African way. You can't wear a crown with your head down. Nothing is complete on its own. You are the king.
So also, it's really interesting to see the dynamic in Beyonce's Black is King film that is associated with The Lion King and the relevant soundtrack to The Lion King, which of course incorporates a lot of African musical artists, and the film itself incorporates a number of photographers, filmmakers, fashion designers, you name it. And I think this is a really poignant sort of positioning and narrative when we're speaking about trends, and we speak about trends in terms of Africa. For a long time, we at Nicola Cooper and Associates have been speaking to the fact that, one, Africa is not only trend forward in terms of our consumption of global trends, but inherently forward when it comes to the generation of trends to the global market. And I think this is really an important narrative to start discussing in terms of empowering local businesses to the outside world, and how we can best do that to represent it accurately to a global audience. I think, you know, with the highlights of many, many different sort of films or artists that have currently given a nod to Africa, or the success of the Black Panther film series, whatever it is that's happening on a global perspective, from both a pop cultural narrative to product narrative to even artistic narratives, it's really important to understand that, you know, when we look at that, we look at it as a trend. So to explain in general that a trend holistically is something that is changing or developing or veering towards. And I think over the past sort of 10 years and even the fast track of it over the past 3 years, we've seen Africa coming to the forefront in terms of many, many sort of narratives from all different creative or cultural or product platforms. So what that means is that there continues to be an interest in what Africa has to offer to the world. So when we look at a trend from a fashion and trend forecasting sort of perspective, it's the prediction of a mood or behavior and buying habits of a consumer at a particular time of season. But I think what's really important to note that it's no longer a question of finding your markets by consumers, by age, geography, or income, but looking into how and why they buy. And this is really imperative when it comes to identifying consumers from a global perspective, and what that inherent golden thread is that ties them into buying a product or buying into a trend, or buying into the idea of a culture, a mood, or a belief, and how that sort of fits into the global consumption of information or product or fashion particularly. So it's interesting to see that I'm just going to give a position in terms of how Africa is differentiated comparatively to the rest of the world. So many of you who are familiar with my work have heard me sort of stipulate over and over again that the African continent has the largest youth bulge in the world. So when we're looking at Africa comparatively to the world, the global median age has increased from 21.5 years in 1970 to 30 years old in 2019. So when we're looking at different market spaces, and just to give you a different example, your Australian median age is on average 38. Comparatively to the African continent, where the median age is 19.7 years old, and then the median age in South Africa is around 24 years old. So when we look at Africa comparatively to the globe, we're looking at a very, very young, dynamic continent, not only in terms of the age, but also in terms of identity formation, innovation, and just thinking on the continent. So I think that when we are looking to Africa, we are looking to a very young, continent that is challenged by great adversities, but at the same time is meeting those adversities or those complexities around culture. So it's a really interesting space, not only what we have to offer to the world, but those working within a diverse market space that has rural, has established cities, has a dynamic of different languages and different income levels, that as South African or African businesses, we have a lot to offer in terms of insight to the world. So when we look at African trends on a global scale, this really infers to what my business, Nicola Cooper and Associates, focus is, which is the globalization or glocalization or localization of trends. So what this means in terms of the global market is how we can look at global trends and how they are manifesting within a local context, how we can look at local trends, how they are manifesting from a local to local context, and then how we're looking at African trends from a local to global context, and how that sort of can fuel all the various market spaces. So what we're seeing is really through films like Black is King, or through artists like Beyonce or Black Panther or many other sort of platforms, we are seeing the interest in and the sort of the expedition of African trends to a global market, and what that is in terms of the freshness to our sort of European, Americanized counterparts. So when we speak about globalization, you know, it is a hybridization of words, which means globalization and localization. So what this is a product or service that is developed and distributed globally, but is also adjusted to accommodate the user or the consumer in a local market. And what we're starting to see now is the importance of acknowledging diversity, not only from outside business coming into the African landscape, but even within other markets in terms of Americanized markets, suddenly starting to realize the sensitivities, delicacies, and diversities of their own culture, and how you can start building products around the understanding that Black Lives Matter is a critical conversation, how diversity and articulation really has great opportunity in the development of products or even communication. So what we're starting to see is the importance of the creation of products or services for the global market by adapting them to local cultures, and what local cultures, like an African culture, and we speak about, I'm speaking about it holistically now, can offer to a global market. So I think it's really important to understand that at every level, this means we're speaking about a concept, a trend or an item, and understanding on how it can be applied to different settings whilst maintaining the core elements that's aligned to its cultural environment. So when we look at the globalization of trends, we're looking at the idea of the overarching ideas that are presenting to a local market in an accessible way that allows for companies to align themselves to international ideas that can be efficiently executed at local levels as well as global levels. So what this means, and I'm just going to sort of leave this slide sort of on screen while I'm speaking to this, is what we're starting to see is great opportunity in terms of not only producing products or South African products for a South African market, but also South African products for a global market. And what that means is not denouncing the core values or core aesthetics of what that product is to a global market, that now we're starting to identify the universal appeal that we do have and the value and the weight of African narratives, African aesthetics and African design and what that value is to the world, and rather encouraging and empowering those conversations, those products, those categories, rather than trying or attempting to alter them. I think this is where we have an inherent value to the global community in terms of creation and monetization. So what we're really starting to see globally is Africa as a trend driver. So Africa over the past, I mean, we've always seen, from those of us who have been operating within Africa, we've always seen our impact on the world. But I think what we're starting to see more and more so is the acknowledgement of independent designers or brands or businesses and the value that they place on themselves and what they present to the world. So this is really around the notion that Africans are beginning to deem and claim what they perceive to be African, rather than having external opinion of what is perceived as African. So what this means is challenging Western constructs, challenging the auto-exotic, westernized, Americanized or Eurocentric perspective of what is African. What we're starting to see is businesses and designers and fashion sort of taking a stand and saying, well, this is African because it is created from us within Africa to speak to the world, rather than what we've inherently been taught is from the outside looking in. So this is really what we're starting to see at the ground level and what we're sort of presenting to the world. So what's really imperative when it comes to speaking to the idea of globalization, whether it be African globalization or globalization within America or Europe, is that what's really important to note is that primary to these sorts of communications or platforms, or even product development or building of brands or businesses, is trust, representation, culture, and collaboration. So what we mean is that, and that's really to speak to the film that I showed at the beginning, the Beyonce's Black is King. What we saw after the launch of that was a lot of acknowledgement to Beyonce and how, in colloquial terms, she did that. And I think what's really important to acknowledge in all of that is the value of the fashion designers, the music artists, the stylists, the filmmakers and photographers' contribution to the Black is King product. So what that means is that not only in terms of trade and product, but in terms of media, intellectual property, visual aesthetic, how it's important to empower those sort of associations within the fashion landscape as well. And how we can build better relationships that those contributors or products and product offerings are taken care of, that they're treated fairly, that when we speak about collaboration, we speak about collaboration in its truest sense, and not as a sort of commission or hierarchical system. So what this means is that you, in terms of that, you also work to understand your consumers' fears and build strategies that alleviate these through transparencies and through communications, that you build capacity through your businesses that allow you to extend your role into communities, particularly given the current climate and COVID-19 and the sense of crises around the world. this also means to take leadership role in the things that concern your consumers. It's a really important time to take note of what communities and consumers are saying to you, and that we utilize our platforms in order to engage with consumers, collaborators, businesses, or brands, and not communicate at them, rather communicate with them. And then the last point, which is vital, is to think locally, to create resonance through efforts that build trust. I think in most cases, specifically when I speak about the South African landscape and business landscape, your consumers really want to see beyond the product. They want to see how it's empowering communities, how it is uplifting the economy. Is it of benefit? Is it going to generate jobs in the future? These are really important factors that are not only important for you as a business, but for your consumer in the consumption of your product, because your product is no longer just a product. I think it represents a lot more to your consumers, and particularly your younger consumers who are now hyper aware and hyper connected to who is making the clothing. Is it sustainable? Are your staff members treated ethically? Are they paid correctly? Is it a healthy environment? So this, of course, brings up a really imperative sort of highlight, which is, you know, the shifts around COVID-19, what that means in terms of the local markets, and how we can look at it in terms of how it's shifting your consumers' lifestyle. And what this means is that the shift in lifestyle inherently develops a shift in your consumers' mindset and their consumption of products. So what we're starting to see is, as a result of COVID-19 and what that impact has had on your consumers' lifestyle has inherently affected how they consume products and how they articulate with businesses. And what that means to them in the long run. So how are you looking at this COVID-19 and how it's impacted your consumers from both a localized and global perspective? And how are you seeing the opportunities and looking at the long-term changes that have been impacted as a result of COVID-19 and your consumers' shifting lifestyles? But as well as that, how it's impacting the fashion world. So some of the points are the rise of e-commerce and m-commerce, the availability of sales platforms and distribution centers. So if we look at sales platforms in terms of e-commerce or those distribution centers, so from an African perspective or South African perspective, if you can look at Take-A-Lot or Superblis and those platforms, but then the introduction of Amazon to Africa and what that's going to mean as a distribution center for African products, but also looking at the shifts for fashion style, shapes, and products as a result of your consumer shifts in lifestyle, as well as the alteration in media consumption, and the shifts in manufacturing and the potential for local, and in how I'm speaking of local is from an African perspective, and what that means for manufacturing locally for both a global and local markets. And also looking at the macro shifts in marketing and what we are starting to see in terms of what our consumers want in terms of the marketing shift, which is the demand for transparent conversations and almost expecting brands to take a position in whatever sort of space they are sort of taking part in, whether that is a lifestyle or whether that is a sales perspective. And as I said earlier, products are no longer just products. Consumers are aligning with brands who treat their businesses as ethical, sustainable, inclusive, and they're not afraid to pay more for a brand that aligns to them from a personal, political, or aspirational perspective. And I think this is really important to note, you know, even from outside brands hoping to engage with the African market, but as well as African brands hoping to reach a global market. So just as a sort of snapshot from WGSN's retail summary, that 60% of retail executives surveyed said that they are developing propositions that speak to local communities. And this is really around, again, the conversation on how we as Africans or South Africans can encourage these kinds of conversations in terms of retail from an African or South African perspective, as well as how we can engage in those conversations from Africa to outside of the African sort of geographical boundaries. So what this means is around radical transparency and how we can speak to all factors of the fashion industry, from design, supply chain, and production, to markup costs and what these brands earn per item sold, and how we can do and how we can include forward-thinking businesses that are providing the details of products, supply chains, and providing a platform for consumers to learn who makes their clothing, and also platforms in which to empower local businesses for a global market. So around sort of radical transparency, this really fuels to how consumers and their preference of understanding of where their items or products or businesses come from and what that means, so that they can engage and support brands that align to their personal opinions, as well as align to their morals or ethics or beliefs. So it's really important to understand that, you know, these are primary trends that existed pre-COVID-19, but have since been fast-tracked as a result of COVID-19 and the time and sort of just what this current climate of crisis has generated in terms of our consumption and our narratives or our conversations to the external world, as well as to our localized world. So this brings about, you know, what local positioning is in terms of trends in a local capacity, and then how do we empower those trends from a local positioning to a global market. And just to sort of articulate that in terms of, it's really important to understand these kinds of nuances that exist, and the importance around what I discussed earlier around understanding cultural sensitivities, understanding cultural nuances and delicacies, and these kinds of conversations, so that we can avoid offending people, avoid sort of allowing products to be created or marketing to be created that is of detriment to our businesses. And what that means is making sure that when we communicate, we are hyper aware of our consumers and what is important to them and what we represent to them as businesses. So just to sort of position my next slide, which is a film, is, you know, a number of occasions we, excuse me, at Nicola Cooper and Associates work with global brands entering the African market. And one of the prime sort of conversations that we speak with sort of global brands entering the African market is that there is no copy and paste approach that should come in to an emerging market within Africa. So what that means is that advertising or products or brand positioning should understand the markets that they are entering into within an African landscape. So what that means is that what works for America, or what works for Europe, what works for Australia, or what works for other markets doesn't necessarily work for an African market. And similar vein, we have to look at what works for an African market and how we can find something within the African market and take it to the global market that has universal appeal. So what this means is recently in the media, we saw outrage in terms of our local retailer Clicks Pharmacies and the introduction of advertising around one of their specific product, which was a Tresemme hair brand, and how Clicks had utilized the Tresemme advertising, which was the universal Tresemme advertising, and had positioned ethnic hair as damaged hair and non-ethnic hair or Caucasian hair as, you know, the ideal model for hair. What this did, obviously, was kick up what was an offensive mechanism, what was a cultural insensitivity, but also a general awareness of what that means from a global market coming in and how we need to vet communications so that these opportunities are not harmful in terms of how we can introduce global brands to a localized market. So just showing you the clip. So just speaking to that clip, really what we saw was a political party in South Africa known as the EFF, who then had protests around the Clicks pharmacy and sort of challenging the advertising that was associated with the Tresemme brand. Similarly, we saw this form of activism in the past with H&M and the Coolest Monkey in the Jungle online retail, and how it manifested in protest within the South African landscape for all H&M stores that in some cases were damaged, in some cases closed for a number of days as a result of this sort of cultural insensitivity, and how we need to be hyper aware now in 2020 and going into the future and question ourselves why this is still happening. So when we're looking at all of these facets, we need to look at what this means for local, and what that means for local brands, and what that means for local brands currently speaking to a global market. So we're seeing a growing adoption of African-driven styles that allow for growth in the global exposure of local designers. This also provides international platforms for brands that never had these platforms in the past, but also when you know, there's high level exposure when they're being associated with international celebrities. This is really fundamental to the international growth of South African and African fashion. As you can see here, this is Zendaya wearing Tebe Magugu, who is a local South African fashion designer for InStyle magazine in September 2020. So I think what we're starting to see is a current shift, not only in, you know, our local market absorbing global products, but in reverse, international market absorbing African and South African products. So what this means is greater opportunity for manufacturing and collaboration in Africa. Many local and global brands are beginning to identify the importance of collaboration with local businesses, brands, and independents or collectives. Some of these collaborations include IKEA's collaboration with African designers, Nando's Design Africa competition, Pick and Pay, local retailers, collaboration partnerships with the designers launching in 2020, the Woolworths Styled by SA collection, but also looking at spaces like MIA London, which is the acronym for Made in Africa. MIA London sources tailors via recommendations from experts in the fashion industry in both South Africa and Zambia. And their next collaboration is set to happen in Nigeria towards the latter part of this year and 2021, but also looking at global platforms such as Vogue Talents, Scouting for Africa 2020, which is part of Italian Vogue, in collaboration with the African Fashion Foundation, what this means for a local design or local business in a global perspective, utilizing these global platforms. But then also looking at trailblazers like Tebe Magugu, who was the LVMH 2019 prize winner, and what that has done in terms of highlighting not only the work that Tebe does as a fundamental designer with a specific narrative coming from South Africa, but also those who are identifying Tebe and the potentials of other Tebes within South Africa or Africa, and then looking at sort of trailblazers like Cedric Mazero from Rwanda, you know, and what he has done in terms of social change and his long-term project, Fashion for All. We're looking at men and women in rural villages and presenting inclusive visions of fashion which rejects limitations based around age, size, social or economic status, but also looking at Palesa Mopang and her collaboration with H&M. So I think, like I said, I've thrown a lot of information at you today, and I'm sure you're sort of feeling really, really overwhelmed. But I really wanted to throw everything but the kitchen sink at this so that I could introduce Erica as the panelist and potentially let her utilize my platform on which to build her conversation from, and then hopefully at the end of her short slides we can go into some of the points around African fashion and what that actually means, and is there such a thing as African fashion, and how we can drive those necessary conversations from both a product or market, retail, monetized perspective, but also from a cultural, intellectual, and philosophical perspective. I'm going to hand over to you, Erica.
Thank you, Nicola, so much for your very comprehensive presentation, and I think for everybody it's given us a hell of a lot of food to kind of reflect on. So I'm very aware that we are running low on time, and Sim will follow me, and hopefully we'll have either time to gather up some questions that we can then respond to afterwards. So I'm really not going to take up a lot of time, but as Nicola introduced me, I'm the co-director of the African Fashion Research Institute. Nicola, if you want to just go to the next slide. And I think what Nicola's presentation really addressed is
Sorry, I'm having a bit of an issue. There we go.
Great. And the question that you presented the afternoon session under is why African fashion matters. And so I'm really going to take 3 points. And the first point, I'm starting at the end, that it matters. And we're seeing that it matters. We're seeing that somebody like Beyonce that you opened your session with, but also just in terms of different markets and different market responses. But we're seeing also what's happening in museums. So I'm just sharing this particular image, which was an exhibition I curated at Zuid-Afrika, as a museum that's starting to take fashion from Africa seriously. And this particular exhibition showcased 21 South African designers. But following shortly on this, other museums are starting to express an interest in creating and curating fashion from the African continent. And I'm kind of in conversation with a number of museums in London, in America, in the Netherlands, that are starting to take fashion a bit more seriously. So this move of a practice, of a material practice into a museum space that's taken more seriously. So in that sense, this kind of sort of seriousness, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit further. The second thing that I wanted to address was, what is this idea of African fashion? And this particular exhibition at Zuid-Afrika was South African fashion, but immediately you've got two rooms in this exhibition, and the first room is the room on the left, and guests would enter in, and is this African fashion? Was the kind of surprised response. And I think very often I would say we're lazy. We're lazy and we're not taking full responsibility, because thinking about what is African fashion. So that's my second provocation. So we know that it matters, but what is African fashion? What do we mean when we say African fashion? And how do your audience, or how do your consumers, or how do your colleagues understand what African fashion is? And the general perception is it's print. It's print, it's bold, it's bright, but the entire presentation that Nicola has shared with us mixes up. There are very bold moments, there are very quiet moments, there are very printed moments, there are very plain moments. So my initial entry in this particular exhibition was to present African fashion, South African fashion, that started to disrupt some of that. So if you go to the next slide, Nicola. And so this idea that African fashion is print, and it circulates in objects like this particular fabric map. But this map is doing something else. It's starting to complicate. Not all print is representative of the whole of Africa. So it's starting to complicate and starting to make slightly more defined decisions about different types of print. So East African printed textiles are not the same as West African printed textiles, and not the same as for example, Mali and Bogolan, or the Tuareg and the Indigo. So we have a responsibility to start to name these things. And Adebayo from Orange Culture, recently I listened to a talk, and he was saying it is our responsibility to educate and to start to complicate the narrative. So get to know your terms, get to use them, and not be lazy and just collapse the entire continent into a single moniker, African fashion. So one way to help you through that is to say fashion from Africa. So fashion from Africa, suddenly sort of fashion from Africa. The second way is to start to name. So Nicola, if you just go to the next slide, is to start to populate and to start to illustrate diversity. And so this was a recent Vogue challenge where stylists, photographers, designers occupied the cover of Vogue with images or representation that they would like to see of more diverse images, more diverse representation of fashion from Africa. And to start to name and illustrate and occupy different definitions of and different representations of, so that we're not either a backdrop to an international brand, a Vivienne Westwood with a backdrop of the African savannah, you know, as a classic sort of stereotype, but we're actually on the cover, we are claiming that space, so occupying that space. And then the next slide. And so to think about African fashion is the provocation that Sunny Delat titled his book. So Sunny Delat is a Kenyan curator and part of the Nest Collective, and they published a book called Not African Enough. Yeah. Because in his own work and in the work of his colleagues in Kenya and across the continent that he's collaborated with, very often if fashion made in Kenya or Rwanda or Egypt is not printed and not garish or not beaded or not stereotypically African, they are being termed, it's not African enough. It's not African enough. So this idea of breaking and disrupting that. So the publication of the book, so Sunny Delat published the book, Not African Enough, but this particular performance here, you will see it's a very early morning performance. It was a fashion performance in Sao Tome in 2019. And Sunny very courageously managed to gather 52 garments from across the continent, representing 52 countries of Africa, into one collective presentation. And so I think this is a film that he's busy, he has produced a film from that particular event. So, and it's in their finest robes, the children shall return. But this idea of Africa is a continent of 54 different countries. So if you want to go to the next slide. And Nicola's spoken about Thebe Magugu's work quite a lot. And what we're doing in this process of redefining the terms of what fashion from Africa is we're pushing back against a kind of colonial narrative. And it is incredibly important that we do that. So Thebe Magugu and his particular journey to take this particular exhibition, so this was a photographic exhibition that he set his work in Ipopeng in Kimberley, and these photographs then traveled to Paris. So as Nicola said, the journey was in the opposite direction. But it is to occupy spaces in Paris with stories from the continent. And these are authentic stories. And that's my last point really around why African fashion matters. So we understand that it matters. We understand that there's this complexity and we need to take responsibility for how we're naming it. What is this thing? Fashion from Africa. And the third is why. Why is it important at this point? And in the broader sort of conversation around fashion, global fashion, I think the idea that we need to think about the earth differently. We need to think about our fellow citizens differently. We need to think about nature differently. We need to think about the way in which we live on the earth. So meaning has become incredibly important in the making of fashion. So Thebe is very outspoken in his persistence to tell the story, to tell his story, but also to manufacture in South Africa and to empower not only himself, but an entire community. So there's an economics that this is going to, and why things are important. There is always this idea of money. So when H&M needs to close their stores for a day, it means money. That's why it matters as well. You don't mess with us because it'll mess with your pocket. But also, it means money in terms of, so for Tebe Magugu, enriching a community of makers and enriching a community of an entire fashion system, from weaving to fabric development, to making, to seamstresses, to retailers, etc. So it's an entire economic infrastructure. And then the final slide that I want to say, share with you is, it matters on the ground, and it matters to us as well, and why African fashion matters to South Africans. And this is Gojiji, and they're a Khayelitsha-based entrepreneurial brand, and this was their very small selection of their collection that they showcased at Khayelitsha Fashion Week. And if anybody has an understanding of the context of what that means to build a brand in Khayelitsha, and in terms of the kinds of access to materials, and what that means to build attention to communities of people that can start tell a particular kind of narrative. So in terms of handing this over to Sim, and maybe to a set of questions, if we have time for a set of questions, is the absolute importance of Nicola's message around localization, how it matters to the team in Khayelitsha building a brand, and the ripple effect of what that does to community, what that does to value, what that does to economics, what that does to pride, and what that does to economic sustainability. So I think if I can say thank you very much, Nicola, and I think we'll, if we've got a moment, we can maybe share the final slide, Luciba, if you want to use that just before you introduce.
To our audience, we are running a little bit over time, and that's because these are really, really important discussions. So I hope that you'll just bear with us so that we can continue. We won't go too long over time, but hopefully finding it really valuable. Sorry, Eve.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Mercy Frankfurt. Yeah.
Do you want to just explain Luciba's perspective?
No, good.
Okay, I'm just going to invite Sim, and I think that once Sim has just discussed USAID and what that means, we can go into some of my questions and then sort of end off the session.
Thank you, Nicola. And once again, thank you to both of you, Nicola and Erica. Some very important information that we're picking up from yourselves, and we're really grateful for that. I'm conscious of the time, so I will not take too much of your time so that we can actually attend to questions. But I think what's important for us from a USAID Trade Hub is just to try and get all this together. When we talk about Beyonce, a global icon, actually pushing African fashion into the US, and on the other hand, we're looking at your traditional partners, the US and China, the trading relations not so much as good at the moment. We see an opportunity for the African supplier and African fashion producer. So what we are really saying is that there's actually an opportunity, because there's AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that allows countries from eligible countries from Africa to actually export into the US duty-free. And clearly it's actually an opportunity for us to take advantage of that. And that makes us very competitive after about 32%, which is a very good thing to do. So just briefly, again, not to take too much of your time, is that there's about 6,500 products, tariff lines that are actually eligible for importation into US under AGOA, duty-free. And what this does is that it actually allows our suppliers to actually access a very, very big market, which would actually make us better at diversifying our markets. And maybe just briefly as well, instead of going through the whole presentation, I can just, in terms of looking at how the USAID Trade Hub can actually work with partners in the region to try and explore the US market. So we have currently looking we expose our suppliers to the US through various means. We do what we call buyer missions, where we bring in buyers into the region to look at our factories. This is obviously not happening at the moment because of COVID, but we've had some very exciting developments. COVID has actually brought up some good ideas. We're having virtual buyer missions at the moment, where buyers actually visiting factories virtually. So virtually factory tours virtually that we actually arrange for export-ready partners that we deal with. We also do trade shows in the US or wherever we believe that the market is available, in this case, the US and South Africa. And we currently actually participate in various virtual trade shows in the US, which we'd love to actually expose our partners, our fashion producers to. And we also do a lot of B2B activities, very active on there as well. And besides all that, what we look at as well is we assess companies and try and bridge the gaps between where they are and where they ought to be so that they can be appealing to the US market. That might include actually looking at social compliance issues, which are very big issues in the US. And yeah, so maybe briefly, I can just maybe take it up to there. And all I can maybe invite the participants to do is, because we're doing a series with Messe Frankfurt, we've got a lot of information that we've been sharing with the various, within our various webinars. And we really invite participants to go through our website and go through all those webinars that are very informative. And again, as at the end of the webinar, we're going to be sharing information so that we can actually take these conversations outside the webinars. So without maybe taking too much of the time, I can refer you back to Nicola so that we can maybe go through the questions before we lose more time.
Sure. I think, Sim, I do have a question for you. I think, you know, how big of a business would you need to be to want to start targeting, you know, outside of Africa? How big do you need to be? And also, is this only isolated to product? So, you know, and what I mean by product in terms of physical, tangible product, or would this be, and I'm probably like to use my business as an example, which is research and intellectual property that fuels fashion. So, you know, because there are those intangible assets as well as the tangible one. And of course, our fashion chain doesn't just exist as designer and product, it exists, you know, through the line in terms of photographers and filmmakers and stylists. How can all of those different facets, is there an opportunity for trade beyond product, I think is my question.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I think that's a very, very good question, especially when it comes to how big should you be to actually be able to look at export markets. The US market is a very interesting one because it's so big and it's got so many different buyers out there. The first impression we get when you're talking to the US, maybe we think of the big Walmarts, but you've got the private label organizations that are actually running very, very strong. So in a nutshell, it's not so much about size, actually getting your product to fit the market that you're targeting, which is where we're actually very useful in terms of actually creating those linkages, because we've got our teams out in the US who actually understand the market a lot more. Mm. And then on the second question, in terms of intangibles, it's also very exciting to know that designers are all over the world right now. So that kind of, you know, intellectual capital is required everywhere. And we see that a lot. There's a lot of linkages that can be created there. And there's actually no limit in terms of where we go with that, Nicola.
That's incredible to note. I think, Sim, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are on the screen here. Many are asking for yourself and George to share your information. Where can some of the participants get a hold of you?
Great. I think on our presentation slide right now, we've got all the contacts of all our colleagues in the different countries. We've got country representatives in all the 7 countries that work in, and besides Africa. So all those contacts are sitting on there, and we should be able to share them on the screen, if you don't mind, Neil, so that people can actually be able to access the US Trade Hub.
Okay, great. And I think my question for Erica is, you know, I think we speak about, and I think it's a really valuable point of this perception of African fashion versus fashion from Africa. And I think that in to the point of not African enough, I think that's, I mean, in my experiences, this places a great limitation on our designers, but also the question is, who is determining what is African? So I think in terms of those kinds of conversations, is there any spaces that we can investigate further? Can people contact you around what that idea is? Where is it from the outside telling the African continent what is African and what they expect from Africa? Or are we starting to alter that narrative and position it as what Africans deem and claim as African?
Nicola, thank you. Yeah, I think what was very obvious to me and perhaps some other members in the audience is that across all your slides, many of your slides illustrated work by African creatives. Designers from Rwanda, or designers from stylists from across the continent, South African fashion designers. So creating that image. So the question you're sort of saying, who is creating those messages, or who is creating those stories? Is it up to us, or is it up to a global perception? I think we need to create that pushback. I think that's really, really important. We need to educate ourselves. We need to educate ourselves about what's going on elsewhere in the continent. So know what's happening in Mozambique on the fashion scene, know what's happening on the fashion scene in Lagos, read up about, so it is coming from the continent. I think that this definitely needs to be developed, but I think also we're being listened to differently elsewhere. So I think there's a reception to our story in quite an important way. So we need to take that gap. We've also got colleagues across the globe who are starting to listen to the stories from the continent in very different kinds of ways. And so to say, you know, the African Fashion Research Institute really aims to want to do that. We've just launched about a year ago as a project together with Lesiva and myself, and we're working on launching our website. But as creative entrepreneurs, these things take time. So perhaps through yourselves or through Mercy Frankfurt, if people want to make contact, my details are available.
Okay, great. And you'll see currently on your screen is all the contacts for the country representatives for USAID and the hub. So I think just screen grab or take note quickly. And while you're doing that, I just wanted to thank everyone and thank Sim, specifically Erica, George, Neil, and his team from All Fashion Sourcing for allowing me the honor of presenting today and the honor of speaking with such esteemed people in their fields and experts. And just to highlight that there are a few more opportunities and webinars coming up. One is on the 23rd of September, which is sustainability in fashion. And then the 29th of September, what US buyers look for in products imported into America. So I think this will go into more detail, kind of what Sim and I discussed from a top level, and now as business owners or makers or entrepreneurs, you are able to see what the actual fundamental steps are in that. So once again, I thank you for your patience, for allowing us to go over time and unpack this with the time that it really, really needs. And thank you to everyone that has partaken today, as well as everyone that made it happen. Thank you so much. For those of you who wish to contact me, it is nicola@nicolacooper.co.za. Handing over to you, Neil.
Thank you, everybody. Please look out for our next webinar, as Nicola mentioned, and we'll see you soon. Thank you for joining us. Take care.